The chronicles never speak with certainty, yet the shadows of rumor often outlive the brightness of truth. In the cold corridors of England's medieval castles, whispers took shape, whispers of a curse that had been uttered long before the birth of a boy who would be called Richard. It was said that no heir of York would wear the crown without blood staining his hands, and no child of that line would escape the claws of betrayal. England was already a wounded kingdom, torn open by the Wars of the Roses. Brothers had slaughtered brothers beneath banners of red and white, and fields that once promised harvest were sown instead with bones. Amid this turmoil, prophecy became as sharp as steel. Women muttered it over dying hearths, priests cloaked it in sermons, and rivals wielded it as a weapon. That one day, a son of York would inherit a throne, only to see it crumble beneath him. Into this foreboding silence, a cry pierced the night. Richard, born into the dynasty of York, came not under the warm glow of triumph but under the weight of omens. Some swore that the storm that raged on his birth was not mere weather, but the heavens themselves bearing witness to the calamities his life would summon. Others insisted that the boy was marked from the start not by deformity, as later storytellers would claim, but by destiny cruel and unrelenting. The kingdom did not pause to honor him. It was a land too busy bleeding. Armies marched, alliances shifted like sand, and the crown itself seemed less a symbol of glory than a prize in a deadly game. Yet even then, among the midwives and courtiers who beheld the child, there lingered unease. It was as though the very air around him had grown heavy, charged with the unseen hand of fate. And so the curse was tied to him before he could walk, before he could speak. A curse not written in parchment nor sealed with wax, but carried in the murmurs of the people and the silent dread of those who knew the fragility of kingship. Richard's path, they said, was already drawn. To rise toward the crown through shadows and betrayal, to wear it for but a moment, and to fall with a violence that history itself would struggle to contain. For in England, power was never simply inherited, it was stolen, wrestled, drowned in blood. And Richard, still swaddled in cloth, had already been chosen as its most tragic heir. The story that follows is not merely of a king, but of a boy shackled to a destiny carved long before his first breath. A destiny cursed, inevitable, and merciless. He was born not into a cradle of peace, but into a battlefield disguised as a kingdom. Richard of York, the youngest son of a turbulent house, came into the world in 1452, an infant whose existence was already woven into the fierce tapestry of England's Civil War. His birth, though celebrated by a dynasty hungry for heirs, was less a moment of joy than a breath held in anticipation. For in those days, every child of York was both a beacon of hope and a potential pawn in the great game of crowns. The court that welcomed him was a place of brilliance veined with poison. Velvet halls echoed with the laughter of nobles, yet that laughter masked suspicion sharper than daggers. Richard's father, Richard, Duke of York, stood as claimant to the throne itself, defiant against King Henry VI and the rival house of Lancaster. From the moment of his first cry, the child was bound not to lullabies but to war drums. He was the 11th of 12 children, a fragile branch on a tree destined to be hacked apart by ambition. His siblings circled the crown like moths around flame, and each carried within them the same burden, to either rise or to perish. But even among them, Richard seemed marked. Those who saw him as a child noted his quietness, the gravity in his gaze, as though he had already seen too much of the world. He was not the golden heir like his brother Edward, nor the charming George, but something else, something forged in silence. Beyond the palace walls, England tore itself to pieces. The Wars of the Roses raged across muddy fields, where the banners of York and Lancaster clashed like storms. By the time Richard could walk, he was already in exile. His family was driven into hiding, their castles seized, their names cursed. He learned early that to survive meant to endure loss. The loss of safety, of home, and soon of kin. When his father was slain at Wakefield and his elder brother Edmund butchered in the same battle, the blood of kin became Richard's first inheritance. He was only 8 years old when their heads were paraded through the streets by the victors, crowned mockingly with paper diadems. For most children, nightmares are the stuff of fancy. For Richard, nightmares were history made flesh. Yet from this crucible of blood, his will hardened. He did not cry, at least not in sight of others. He learned to wear silence as armor, to carry grief as fuel. He was, even as a boy, a shadow taking Shapian heir not to peace, but to a kingdom that devoured its sons. Richard's birth was not an opening into promise. It was the first act of a tragedy whose lines had been rehearsed long before he entered the stage. The heir had been born, but the curse had already begun to coil around him. England, in the mid-15th century, was no kingdom of stability. It was a fractured realm where loyalty shifted like tides, and the throne itself seemed less a seat of majesty than a prize in a brutal contest. To be born of royal blood was no safeguard, it was a summons to danger. For the houses of Lancaster and York were locked in a war that devoured generations, and young Richard was placed squarely in its maw. King Henry VI, weak of will and prey to bouts of madness, left his kingdom vulnerable. Into that void surged men with sharper instincts and hungrier appetites. His queen, Margaret of Anjou, ruled with a ferocity that struck fear into enemies and courtiers alike. But the Yorkist faction, led by Richard's father, claimed legitimacy with equal conviction. The result was not governance but chaos. Years of battles where victory lasted only as long as a single season before it turned to ashes. Richard's childhood was therefore not measured in the rhythm of games or study, but in the drumbeats of war. One season he might be sheltered within the walls of a Yorkist stronghold, banners fluttering proudly from the ramparts. The next, he would find himself fleeing under cover of night, as those same banners were torn down by rival hands. England itself seemed a living creature, writhing in pain, its soil soaked with the blood of cousins, uncles, and brothers. The boy saw with his own eyes the instability of crowns. Edward, his elder brother, seized victory at Towton in a battle so savage that the rivers ran red. The field was said to have claimed more than 20,000 souls in a single day, their corpses left unburied, a feast for carrion birds. Edward emerged from that storm as King Edward IV, his head adorned with the crown of England. For a moment, York triumphed, and young Richard glimpsed what power could achieve. But even then, the kingdom was not healed. Edward's reign was plagued by betrayal, rebellion, and the ever-returning specter of Lancaster. Richard, still in the shadows, absorbed these lessons. That power was fleeting, trust was poison, and family could just as easily be a dagger at one's back. The realm around him was an echo chamber of treachery. Nobles traded sides for coin or survival, while priests cloaked politics in the language of divine will. In taverns, common folk cursed both roses red and Waitia's thorns that pierced their flesh equally. For Richard, turmoil was not an aberration. It was the air he breathed. He came of age in a world where no oath was sacred, no victory permanent, and no crown secure. He learned, before most boys had learned to wield a sword, that survival demanded cunning, silence, and above all, endurance. It was in this crucible of unrest that Richard began to take shape, not yet a king, not yet a villain in the eyes of history, but already a creature of shadows born to navigate a kingdom at war with itself. While Edward basked in the triumph of Towton and the glittering promise of kingship, his youngest brother remained a quiet figure, almost overlooked. Richard was not a child of sunlight. He was a child of corridors, of whispers, of silences that spoke louder than cheers. In the grand halls of Yorkist power, where feasts were laid and courtiers bent their knees, the boy moved like a shadow along the walls, absorbing more than he revealed. He was small, delicate in frame compared to the broad-shouldered Edward and the affable George. His body, some would later claim, carried the mark of imperfection. Though these tales may have been the inventions of Tudor propaganda, the image endeared a boy whom destiny had twisted in form as it twisted in fate. Whether true or not, Richard himself learned early the sting of rumor and the cruelty of perception. In a court where strength was worshipped, whispers of frailty clung to him like smoke. But if he lacked in stature, he compensated in vigilance. Richard listened when others boasted. He watched when others reveled. He learned to read a man's intent in the narrowing of his eyes, the tremor of his hand upon a goblet. The boy's silence became his weapon, his armor. Where Edward charged with the fire of charisma, Richard crept with the patience of shadow. The court of Edward IV was a glittering theater, but behind the velvet curtains played dramas of betrayal. Nobles who pledged loyalty in daylight plotted rebellion in darkness. Queens and mistresses wove rival webs of influence. Richard, though young, witnessed how swiftly affection soured into conspiracy, how one wrong glance could ignite a feud. His education was not in the classroom alone but in the theater of treachery. When war forced him into exile again, fleeing to the Low Countries with his brother, the shadows deepened. Life in foreign courts was not gilded but precarious, a lesson in humility and endurance. He was taught not only the arts of knighthood but the harsher craft of survival. How to live when all seemed lost, how to measure loyalty by action, not words. Yet even amid this instability, Richard found his identity hardening. He was not destined to shine like Edward, nor to charm like George. He would be something else, an Tyrelia figure molded by absence, by loss, by the cold recognition that power did not belong to those most beloved, but to those most unyielding. The boy of shadows grew into a young man who did not fear the dark. For it was in darkness that he had always lived, and it was from darkness that his destiny would rise. Edward IV reigned like a lion among men, tall, broad, golden-haired, a warrior king whose victories on the battlefield were matched only by his appetites in court. To the people of York, he was the embodiment of triumph. To his enemies, a reminder that the rose of Lancaster had withered but not died. To Richard, Edward was more than a brother, was a son around which the entire dynasty orbited. And yet, even sons burn out. By the late 1470s, the cracks in Edward's reign widened into fissures. His indulgences, once admired, became whispered scandal. His alliances fractured. His marriage to Elizabeth Woodville, a woman of lower birth, seeded resentment among nobles who felt betrayed. Court became a nest of serpents. Woodvilles against Nevilles, old lords against new, loyalty shifting like banners in the wind. Richard, ever the watchful shadow, grew to mistrust not only his enemies but even those who claimed his brother's favor. When Edward's health began to falter, the kingdom felt the tremor. The lion's roar grew hoarse. His once mighty frame swelled with illness. To courtiers, his decline was an open secret, yet few dared to speak of it. Only Richard seemed to look upon the king not with denial, but with a grim recognition that Edward's death would not bring mourning, but chaos. In 1483, the inevitable came. Edward IV, conqueror, usurper, king, was dead. He left behind not only a crown but a fragile legacy. His heir, Edward V, was a boy of 12, too young to hold a sword, too innocent to see the daggers aimed at his back. For Richard, the moment was seismic. His brother's death was not just a personal wound but the shattering of the very foundation on which Yorkist power had stood. The sun was gone, and in its place loomed shadows that threatened to consume everything. To the people of England, Edward's ghost lingered. His sudden absence filled the streets with rumor. Had he been poisoned by the Woodvilles? Had sin and indulgence called divine punishment upon him? To Richard, the ghost was more intimately a voice in his mind, reminding him that the fragile boy who now bore the title of king would not survive without a protector. And who better than Richard himself, Duke of Gloucester, seasoned by hardship, hardened by shadows. But even as Richard stepped forward into the role of guardian, he knew what the court did not yet grasp. Protection and power are often indistinguishable. The ghost of Edward IV haunted not just the halls of Westminster, but Richard's very conscience. For every step he took in his brother's absence led him closer to a throne that had never been meant for him, closer to a destiny cursed from birth. And in the silence that followed Edward's passing, the whispers of betrayal grew louder. When Edward IV died, the crown passed not to a warrior but to a child. Edward V, scarcely 12, was proclaimed king, a boy too young to wield authority, too inexperienced to navigate the venomous world of court. In this fragile interlude, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, stepped forward, cloaked in duty. He declared himself Lord Protector of the realm, guardian of his nephew, steward of a kingdom teetering on the edge of chaos. At first, the mask he wore seemed noble. Richard presented himself as the loyal uncle, the stalwart defender of Yorkist legacy. He had survived exile, battlefield, and betrayal. Now, he appeared as the one man capable of holding the realm together. To many, his humility was convincing. He dressed simply, spoke sparingly, and reminded nobles that he sought not power for himself but stability for England. Yet beneath that mask stirred ambition, or perhaps necessity so ruthless it could no longer be distinguished from desire. For Richard knew the truth. The Woodville faction kin to young Edward V's mother, Elizabeth moved swiftly to seize control. They had already placed their hands upon the boy king, surrounding him with whispering advisors, plotting to rule in his name. To Richard, this was not guardianship. It was theft, and so he resolved to strike first. In a sudden maneuver, Richard intercepted the young king on his way to London. With calm precision, he took custody of the boy, insisting it was for his safety. Edward V, bewildered, trusted his uncle. The Woodvilles did not. They saw in Richard's act the opening of a darker play. From that moment, the protector's mask began to slip. Richard moved Edward and his younger brother, Richard of Shrewsbury, into the Tower of London, not yet a prison, but a royal residence. He assured the council that it was tradition, that no coronation could proceed otherwise. His words were measured, convincing, but in the echo of those stone walls, the future king's laughter was smothered by silence. London watched uneasily. The citizens had seen kings rise and fall before, and they recognized the shifting of winds. Some whispered that Richard truly was a protector, guarding the kingdom from the greedy hands of the Woodvilles. Others whispered louder, that the Duke of Gloucester coveted the crown itself. Richard played his role to perfection. He moved with restraint, spoke with piety, and cloaked each act of consolidation as service to the realm. Yet the more he tightened his grip, the more his intentions darkened. The boy king, once the symbol of Yorkist continuity, became instead a fragile pawn locked within a fortress. The mask of protector had been donned, but behind it, a shadow grew, one that would soon transform an uncle into usurper, and a guardian into a figure of whispered infamy. The Tower of London Grey, ancient and unyielding, had always been more than stone. It was a fortress, a treasury, a prison, and above all, a symbol of power. When young Edward V and his brother, Richard of Shrewsbury, were led through its gates in 1483, the people of England watched with unease. They were told it was tradition, that princes awaited their coronation within those walls. Yet whispers spread like wildfire. The tower could guard heirs, but it could also swallow them. At first, the boys were seen in the gardens, laughing as only children can, unaware of the storm tightening around them. They played with their tutors, leaned over the battlements to glimpse the city below. Londoners, catching sight of them, sighed with relief. "The princes are well," they murmured. "All is as it should be." But days passed, then weeks. The sightings grew fewer. Their laughter no longer echoed across the yard. Guards became stricter, visitors fewer. And then silence. The boys were not seen again. The disappearance struck the kingdom like a thunderclap. Mothers whispered the tale to their children. Nobles exchanged glances in candlelit chambers, and the streets churned with rumor. Had Richard, the protector, now protector turned something else, ordered their confinement to ensure his grip on the crown? Or had they fallen victim to other hands, Woodville loyalists, foreign conspirators, nameless assassins in the night? No one could say with certainty. The truth became tangled in shadow, and history would never resolve it. But perception was its own weapon, and perception turned sharp against Richard. For the image of two innocent princes locked away in a tower and vanishing into the void was too powerful to dismiss. Chroniclers painted the moment with dread. Some claimed the boys were smothered in their sleep, their small bodies buried beneath flagstones. Others told of a dagger's flash, of blood spilled on cold stone. Still others insisted they had been spirited away in secret, to live obscure lives far from the throne. Whatever the truth, the tower became their tomb in the imagination of the people. And Richard, whether guilty or not, bore the weight of it. The whisper of protector curdled into the hiss of usurper. The man who once promised to shield his brother's sons now stood accused in silence, his reputation entwined forever with the ghosts of children. The prince's fate became more than a mystery. It became a curse. Wherever Richard walked, unseen eyes seemed to follow, asking the same unspoken question. What did you do with the boys? The tower had swallowed them whole, and in their absence, a crown glimmered, unclaimed yet within reach. The summer of 1483 carried with it an unease that clung to London like mist over the Thames. The princes, once the fragile hope of the Yorkist line, had vanished behind the walls of the tower, and as their laughter faded into silence, another sound rose in the kingdom, the grinding march of Richard's ambition. What began as whispers soon hardened into proclamation. Learned men priests, lawyers, courtiers stepped forward with startling revelations. Edward IV, they declared, had entered into a secret pre-contract of marriage before wedding Elizabeth Woodville. By law, his union with her was invalid. By law, his children Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury were bastards, and bastards could not wear crowns. This thunderous claim did not arise from nowhere. It was cultivated, nurtured, perhaps orchestrated by the very man now called Protector. Richard, cloaked still in solemn humility, allowed the argument to bloom as though it were the natural fruit of truth. He insisted he sought no power, only justice, only the salvation of England from illegitimate heirs. But each word he spoke drew the crown closer, as though fate itself leaned in his direction. The people wavered. Some, weary of Woodville influence, found relief in the claim. Others recoiled, sensing in this convenient revelation the hand of manipulation. Yet in the council chamber and in the pulpit, voices rose in unison. Richard of Gloucester was the rightful heir. On the 26th of June, 1483, the Protector's mask cracked, and the truther, at least the performance of it, was revealed. Richard accepted the crown of England. In Westminster, the bishops lifted their hands, the nobles bent their knees, and the cheers rang out with rehearsed fervor. The coronation was splendid, dripping with gold and incense, as though the very heavens blessed this new monarch. But beneath the pageantry, the absence was deafening. The true king, Edward V, and his brother did not appear, their shadows haunting every banner, every oath. They were not dead in the eyes of the law, nor alive in the hearts of the people. They were ghosts, and their uncle's crown glittered with their silence. To the world, Richard was now King Richard III. To many, he was a usurper draped in ceremony, a thief cloaked in ermine. The crown sat heavy upon his head, heavier perhaps than any in memory, for it was not made of gold allanite, was forged of rumor, suspicion, and blood. London buzzed with a single refrain. The crown had been stolen. Whether stolen by cunning or necessity, history would debate. But in that moment, Richard had crossed the threshold. He was no longer a protector, no longer a shadow. He was king. And with the crown upon his brow came the weight of destiny, the cursed destiny whispered at his birth, now unfolding before the eyes of all England. The crown was his, but peace was not. Richard III ascended the throne not as a beloved heir, but as a monarch shadowed by suspicion. The great pageants of his coronation could not drown out the silence of the tower, nor could the glitter of jewels erase the memory of two missing boys. To many, England did not gain a king, it lost its innocence. The nobility split like shattered glass. Some, bound by Yorkist loyalty or fear of reprisal, bent their knees and swore allegiance. Others, especially those who had prospered under Edward IV and his Woodville queen, seethed in silence. Across the realm, whispers spread. The princes are gone. The crown is stolen. Richard sits upon a throne carved from the bones of children. Richard sensed the fracture immediately. He moved swiftly, touring the kingdom, dispensing justice with stern efficiency, presenting himself as a ruler of law and order. He reduced taxes, punished corruption, and listened to the grievances of common men in a way few kings had bothered. To the poor he appeared almost righteous. To the powerful he appeared dangerous. But good governance could not erase the wound of usurpation. Every decree he issued, every justice he upheld, was clouded by the unspoken question: where are the princes? The realm's loyalty wavered. In the north, where Richard had long governed with fairness, he still found support. But in the south, resentment simmered. Noble houses whispered of rebellion. Old rivals scented blood. Even Edward IV's allies, once staunchly Yorkist, began to murmur that perhaps the Tudor exile across the Channel Henry might return as savior. Richard's crown, though placed upon his head with ceremony, never sat securely. It was not merely that his legitimacy was doubted. It was that the nation itself was weary. Decades of civil war had scarred England. Each new king promised stability, and each new king delivered more blood. Richard was no exception. At his court, suspicion reigned. Every banquet carried the weight of betrayal. Every oath of loyalty might be a prelude to treachery. Richard trusted few, confided in fewer. Even his queen, and Neville, bore the haunted look of one who sensed that shadows lurked too close. The kingdom was not united by his rule, it was divided by it. And in the cracks of that division, Henry Tudor's name began to echo louder, like the distant roll of thunder on the horizon. Richard wore the crown, but England itself was slipping through his fingers. He had seized power, yes, but power taken in shadow is never secure. It breeds doubt, and doubt breeds rebellion. And rebellion was coming. The crown glittered, but its gold burned upon his brow. Richard III, now sovereign of England, could command armies, dispense justice, and silence enemies, yet he could not silence the voice within. For at the heart of his reign lay an absence too terrible to ignore: the vanished princes. By day, he strode through court with measured dignity, ruling with the confidence of a man convinced of his righteousness. He held audiences, reviewed petitions, and struck down abuses of power. His efforts to appear just were real, even earnest, as though by the strength of his deeds he might cleanse the stain of his ascent. But by night, when the torches burned low and the halls grew silent, the ghosts returned. Some claimed he was haunted in sleep, that he would wake with a start, his breath ragged, his hands clawing at his crown as though it weighed 1,000 stones. Whether he ordered the deaths of his nephews or not, history cannot say with certainty. But in the silence of his chamber, Richard himself may not have known either. Guilt does not always demand truth. It thrives equally on suspicion, and suspicion clung to him like a shroud. The court grew restless under his shadow. Courtiers who once laughed in Edward IV's golden halls now whispered behind cupped hands. Even his allies glanced at him with unease, wondering whether they served a king or a murderer. Rumor sharpened itself into prophecy. A cursed king cannot endure. Richard, ever calculating, sought to smother these whispers. He ordered proclamations defending his legitimacy, sermons in churches affirming divine approval. Yet words could not erase the silence of the tower, nor conjure the faces of two boys who had vanished from the world. The more he insisted upon his innocence, the more the people saw in him a man protesting too much. And so the weight grew heavier. In the stillness of council chambers, he imagined the wide eyes of Edward V staring at him, accusing and unblinking. In the quiet of prayer, he thought he heard the muffled cry of Richard of Shrewsbury. His conscience, whether guilty or merely burdened by suspicion, became his fiercest enemy. For kings may rule with armies and decrees, but they cannot command the mind's theater. In Richard's mind, the princes had not disappeared, they lingered, spectral, eternal. And each time he raised his scepter, each time he donned his crown, it was not the people of England who gazed upon him. It was the eyes of children lost in the tower. Thus the crown, stolen or inherited, became less a symbol of majesty than a relic of guilt. Richard wore it not with pride, but with a burden so heavy that it bent not his body, but his soul. No king, however strong, rules alone. Thrones rest upon web's intricate networks of alliances, promises, and silent bargains. Richard III knew this truth better than most, for he had spent his life watching loyalty bought and sold like coin. Yet even he could not weave a net tight enough to hold the shifting tides of men's ambition. At first, his reign seemed secured by Yorkist strength. Loyal northern lords, hardened by years of service under his governance, swore to him with sincerity. But beyond that circle, the fabric of loyalty began to fray. The southern nobles, steeped in resentment against the fall of the Woodvilles, eyed him with suspicion. Old allies of Edward IV remembered his charm. His generosity qualities Richard did not share. To them, Richard was cold, calculating, a man cloaked in severity. Worse still were those who once called themselves his friends. Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, had been among his fiercest supporters in seizing the throne. It was Buckingham's voice that thundered in council, declaring Edward's children illegitimate. Yet soon after, the Duke turned restless. Whether driven by ambition, greed, or regret at what he had helped unleash, Buckingham began to conspire against the very king he had crowned. The betrayal spread like rot through the kingdom. Letters were exchanged in secret, promises sworn in candlelit chambers. Some nobles reached across the channel, whispering to Henry Tudor, the exile who now styled himself heir to Lancaster. Gold was promised, ships prepared, soldiers pledged. Richard's own network was tangled with venom, and the strands snapped one by one. The rebellion that followed struck like lightning. In 1483, scarcely months after Richard's coronation, Buckingham raised the banner of revolt. For a moment, England trembled, the kingdom on the brink of tearing itself apart once more. Richard, with iron will, crushed the uprising. Buckingham was captured, executed, his head displayed as a warning. But the damage had been done. The image of betrayal lingered, poisoning the air. For Richard, each oath of loyalty now rang hollow. Each smile at court seemed edged with treachery. He grew harsher, more suspicious, binding his closest men tighter, punishing even whispers of dissent. In seeking to control betrayal, he spread fear, and fear bred more treachery still. The web no longer served the king, it strangled him. For every rebellion crushed, another plotted in secret. For every noble executed, two more whispered of Tudor. Richard sat upon the throne, but beneath him the ground shifted. His reign, scarcely begun, was already sinking into the quicksand of conspiracy. He could not see it yet, but every thread of betrayal drew him closer to Bosworth, to the battlefield where his crown and his life would be tested by the weight of history itself. Amid the storms of rebellion and betrayal, one figure remained beside Richard, and Neville, his queen. Her presence was like a pale flame in a draught-filled hall, flickering, fragile, yet steady enough to hold back the dark for a time. She was no stranger to tragedy. Daughter of the great Warwick, the kingmaker, she had been bartered like coin between rival houses, her fate tied to the shifting fortunes of war. She had seen husbands slain, families shattered, her very life treated as a pawn in the endless game for England's crown. When she wed Richard, some whispered it was duty, others ambition. Yet in the years that followed, there grew between them a bond forged in shared loss and silent endurance. Richard, who trusted so few, seemed to trust, and in her he found not political advantage but a companion who knew the cruelty of fate as well as he did. But the crown that glittered on her brow was not a blessing. It was a burden that weighed as heavily on her as it did on her husband. She had seen too much blood to believe in triumph. When she walked the corridors of Westminster, her eyes did not gleam with pride but with sorrow, as though she already sensed the fleeting nature of their reign. The Queen bore Richard a son, Edward of Middle Hampshire, single fragile hope for legacy. Yet destiny, cruel and merciless, struck again. The boy died in childhood, leaving the royal couple hollowed by grief. Chroniclers whispered that the loss broke and spirit. Her health withered, her steps grew slower, and her once vivid presence dimmed into the shadow of mourning. For Richard, this was more than personal tragedy. It was a blow to his already precarious legitimacy. Without an heir, the Yorkist line under his crown stood exposed, vulnerable to rivals who waited eagerly to snatch it away. The death of his son deepened the whispers that Richard was cursed, that no child of his blood would inherit peace, only ruin. And, draped in mourning black, became the silent emblem of that curse. She sat beside her husband at banquets but spoke little, her face drawn with sorrow. The people pitied her, yet their pity turned to unease. To see a queen so frail, so broken, was to see the fragility of the monarchy itself. When Anne herself succumbed to illness in 1485, Richard was left utterly alone. Some claimed he wept. Others claimed he was already too hardened by fate to mourn aloud. Yet all agreed that her death stripped him of the last gentle anchor to his humanity. The Queen of Sorrows was gone, and with her passing, Richard's reign darkened further. No wife, no heir, no shield against the shadows. He was left a solitary figure, a king girded only by ambition and haunted by loss. From the moment of his birth, whispers had spoken of a curse, that no heir of York would hold the crown without drowning in blood, that the dynasty itself was bound to tragedy. By 1485, those whispers had become prophecy fulfilled. Richard sat upon the throne, but around him the world collapsed. His nephews gone, his son the only hope of legacy dead in childhood. His queen lowered into her grave, leaving him widowed and alone. Even the loyalty of his allies, once the steel beneath his rule, had rusted into suspicion. He was king, but he was also a man stripped bare, each loss carving him closer to ruin. The people murmured of divine punishment. How else could one explain such relentless calamity? Priests thundered from pulpits that sin had brought England low, that God's hand would strike down the guilty. To Richard, these sermons were daggers wrapped in scripture. For even if he denied the blood of the princes, even if he swore innocence, the world had chosen its story. Richard the child killer, Richard the usurper, Richard the cursed. The curse did not linger in whispers alone. It materialized in rebellion. Across the Channel, Henry Tudor exile, pretender, descendant of Lancaster gathered support. Foreign powers lent him coin, mercenaries, promises of ships. English nobles, weary of Richard's rule and terrified of his fate clinging to their own, began to defect in secret. Letters passed across the sea like arrows loosed from a bow, binding men to the banner of a stranger who promised deliverance. Even within his court, Richard could not escape the sense of doom. His sleep grew restless, haunted by visions of the dead. His father's severed head crowned with paper mockery, his brothers slain, his son's pale face, his nephew's silent eyes staring from the shadows of the tower. Chroniclers claimed he awoke in terror, his voice echoing with cries not of a king, but of a man pursued by specters. Yet Richard was no coward. He met the gathering storm with defiance. He tightened his control over the north, summoned levies, and prepared his armies. To his men he spoke of destiny, of righteousness, of the will of God. But behind his words lay the heavy truth. He knew the curse was tightening its grip. He could feel it in the restless winds, in the shifting loyalty of his lords, in the hollow echo of his halls now emptied of wife and child. The curse of York had ripened. The crown, stolen or inherited, was no longer a symbol of triumph, but a chain of iron dragging him toward a fate he could neither evade nor deny. And across the Channel, Henry Tudor was come-and-gone executioner disguised as deliverer, carrying with him the final act of Richard's tragic destiny. While Richard clung to a throne shadowed by curses, across the narrow sea another figure was stirring, one who would come to embody both hope and doom. Henry Tudor. To some, he was a mere exile, a man with a thin claim to royalty, the son of an obscure Welsh line. To others, he was the vessel of Lancaster's last breath, the banner under which England might be reborn. Henry had lived much of his life in obscurity, shifting between sanctuaries in Brittany and France. Yet obscurity breeds resilience. He had watched from afar as England devoured itself, had studied the ruin of York and the fall of Lancaster. He was patient, and patience is a weapon sharper than any sword. By 1483, the rebellion of Buckingham had shown him one truth. Richard's reign was fragile, and England longed for deliverance. Foreign powers sensed opportunity. France and Brittany, eager to destabilize Richard, extended cautious support. Gold flowed into Henry's coffers, soldiers gathered beneath his banner, and whispers spread across the channel like wildfire. Disgruntled English nobles began to pledge their allegiance, some openly, many in secret. Each defection was another thread unraveling from Richard's web, each oath sworn to tutor a nail hammered into York's coffin. But Henry's greatest weapon was not his bloodline or his soldiership, was the promise he carried. He vowed to marry Elizabeth of York, the eldest daughter of Edward IV. In that single pledge, he offered reconciliation. York and Lancaster, roses red and white, would at last be entwined. England, bled dry by decades of civil war, seized upon this vision like a drowning man clutching driftwood. Henry was no longer just an exile. He became a symbol of unity. Richard watched the storm gather from his court. He dismissed Henry at first, calling him a pretender, a foreign pawn. Yet as months passed, the shadow across the channel grew larger. Reports arrived of ships preparing, of banners raised, of nobles conspiring. Richard tightened his grip on England, executing suspected traitors, demanding oaths anew. But suspicion breeds fear, and fear breeds betrayal. The harder he clenched, the more men slipped away. Henry's rising was more than political, it was prophetic. To a people who believed in curses and divine justice, his return seemed ordained. If Richard was the usurper, haunted by the blood of children, then Henry was the deliverer, chosen to end the curse. By the summer of 1485, the pieces were set. Henry Tudor had crossed the sea with a modest army, his banner of the Red Dragon unfurling against the sky. He marched not merely as a claimant, but as fate incarnate. And Richard, the cursed heir turned king, prepared to meet him. The stage was set for Bosworth, where prophecy and steel would decide England's future. August 1485. The air itself seemed charged, as though the heavens held their breath. From the south, Henry Tudor advanced, his army modest in number but brimming with fervor. From the north, Richard III summoned the might of England. Banners of the White Rose unfurled across fields and villages, calling men to arms. Two destinies, long foretold, now hurtled toward collision. Henry's force was lean French mercenaries, Welsh recruits, exiles hardened by years abroad. They were not the largest host England had seen, but they carried with them a cause, the promise of unity, the hope that war might finally end. Each mile they marched through English soil brought more defectors, more hearts swayed by the vision of Lancaster and York reconciled in Henry's blood and Elizabeth of York's hand. Richard's army, by contrast, was formidable in size. He had numbers, cavalry, artillery, the full resources of the crown. The lords of the north answered his call, and his camp swelled with soldiers seasoned by years of civil strife. Yet sheer strength cannot silence doubt. Among the ranks, men muttered of omens. They remembered the princes. They remembered Buckingham. They wondered if God's favor had abandoned their king. As the two forces drew nearer, the countryside trembled. Villagers watched columns of men pass their fields, the sound of drums and hooves like distant thunder. Mothers pulled their children close, knowing the land itself would soon be scarred by battle. Priests prayed over terrified congregations, begging heaven to show mercy on England's soul. Richard rode among his men, clad in armor that gleamed like darkened steel. His voice carried with authority, reminding them that he was England's true and rightful king, chosen by God, ordained to crush rebellion. Yet even as he spoke, his eyes betrayed the storm within. For he knew that the loyalty of certain Lord Stanley chief among them was a coin yet to be flipped. Would they ride with him, or betray him at the hour of fate? Henry, meanwhile, pressed forward with grim determination. He had never fought a great battle. His claim was fragile, his chances slim. Yet in his heart burned certainty, the kind that makes ordinary men follow a banner into fire. Each step toward Bosworth was a step toward destiny not just his own, but England's. And so, on the eve of August 22nd, the two armies faced one another across the fields near Bosworth. Campfires flickered like stars upon the earth. Men sharpened blades, whispered prayers, clutched tokens of lovers or saints. In the distance, owls called through the night, as though heralding the spirits soon to join them. The march was over. The stage was set. At Bosworth, England would decide between the cursed heir who wore a stolen crown and the exile who promised deliverance. Only one would leave the field alive. Dawn broke over Bosworth with a sky streaked in crimson, as though the heavens themselves foreshadowed the blood to come. The fields lay damp with dew, the air heavy with silence until the horns sounded. Then the earth shook with the thunder of hooves, the clash of steel, the roar of men. The final act of England's long civil war had begun. Richard's army spread wide, its banners of the white boar and the white rose snapping in the wind. Drums beat like war hearts, and his artillery thundered, belching smoke and fire. Across the field, Henry Tudor's smaller force stood resolute, their red dragon banner unfurling defiantly. Outnumbered, yet unbroken, they advanced with grim determination, their cries of God and St. George carrying over the chaos. At first, the battle favored Richard. His cavalry swept across the field, his archers loosed storms of arrows. Henry's men buckled under the weight of the king's might. Yet battles are not won by numbers alone. The fate of England, like the shifting wind, turned upon the choices of men. All eyes turned to the Stanleys Thomas and William commanders whose forces stood poised, watching. They had pledged allegiance to Richard, yet their loyalty was a dagger still sheathed. Richard waited for their charge. It never came. The Stanleys held back, silent arbiters of destiny, their soldiers unmoving as the struggle raged. Henry, grasping his moment, pressed forward. His small retinue cut through the chaos, heading directly toward Richard himself. It was a gamble, desperate yet bold. If Henry could survive, his banner might yet rally the wavering. Richard saw it. In that instant, he made the decision that would etch his name forever into legend. He spurred his horse forward, lowering his lance, driving into the heart of the melee. He would not flee. He would not retreat. If destiny demanded blood, it would find him in the thick of battle, sword in hand. Chroniclers would later write of the ferocity of that charge. Richard's blade struck true, cleaving through Henry's guards. Men scattered before him, astonished at the king's fury. He fought like a man possessed, his armor dark with sweat, his voice carrying above the din. Treason! Treason! His war cry was both defiance and accusation, hurled at fate itself. But courage alone cannot outmatch betrayal. As Richard cut his way toward Henry, Stanley's forces finally moved against him. Surrounded, outnumbered, Richard fought on. Struck down once, he rose again, blood streaming across his brow. Struck down twice, he swung still, his sword flashing in the sun. He would not yield, not while breath remained in his chest. And so, amid mud and steel, the last Plantagenet king fell. A crown slipped from his helm into the trampled earth, crushed beneath hooves. Richard died not as a coward, but as the warrior he had always longed to, beaking to his final heartbeat, though abandoned by fortune. Bosworth was won, and with it the fate of England was sealed. The moment Richard fell, the battle's fury seemed to shift, as if the field itself exhaled. The white boar, the emblem of his house, was trampled into mud, its once proud standard collapsing into the blood-soaked earth. Around his body, the fighting slackened, for men knew instinctively that the fate of England had been decided. Kings do not die in silence. Their deaths thunder across centuries. Richard's end was brutal, stripped of ceremony. Accounts tell of his helmet wrenched away, his skull cleaved by a halberd, his body pierced again and again as if vengeance itself guided every blade. He had charged like a lion, but in the end, he lay broken in the mire, surrounded by enemies and abandoned by supposed friends. Betrayal was his true executioner. When the last blow fell, a strange stillness spread. The king once crowned, once feared, once cursed was no more. Soldiers who had fought against him gazed down at his corpse, half in awe, half in horror. For though they rejoiced in victory, they could not deny the spectacle of a monarch slain on the battlefield. It was a sight England had not witnessed in generations. The victors wasted no time in turning death into message. Richard's body, stripped of armor, was thrown naked across a horse's back, his head lolling, his wounds unhidden. Thus paraded, he was carried ignominiously into Leicester, not as a sovereign but as spoil. Townsfolk gathered in silence, some in pity, others in grim satisfaction. The sight of a dead king dragged through the streets seared itself into memoria warning written in flesh. Chroniclers lingered on the moment, each pen dripping with either venom or pity. To Tudor propagandists, Richard was the tyrant slain by divine justice, his mangled body proof of God's will. To others, he was the last true warrior king, betrayed rather than defeated, fallen not in cowardice but in defiance. His cry of "Treason! Treason!" echoed long after the clash of swords had ceased, a dirge for the age of York. Yet death, in its cruelty, offered Richard a final paradox. The man accused of monstrous ambition, of child murder, of tyranny, had died with a valor that even his enemies could not deny. His reign was short, his crown disputed, but his end was undeniably kingly. Sword in hand, unyielding until the last breath. And so Richard III passed into history no longer merely a man, but a symbol of cursed ambition, of betrayal's poison, of destiny's cruelty. His body lay broken, but his story had only begun, for posterity would seize upon it, twist it, immortalize it. The king was dead. The curse had claimed him, and in his fall, England itself was reborn under new hands, new banners, new lies. Richard's death on the battlefield might have been remembered with honor, had his body been treated with dignity. But in Bosworth's aftermath, respect was denied him. The victors understood that a fallen king was more than flesh, was a symbol. And symbols, if left untamed, can ignite rebellion. Thus Richard's corpse became a canvas for humiliation. Stripped of armor, his body was left bare, his wounds exposed to the gaze of friend and foe alike. He was slung ignominiously across a horse, head dangling, arms swaying lifelessly as though mocked by the rhythm of hooves. The once proud monarch who had charged into battle with a crown upon his helm now entered Leicester as spoil, paraded like a criminal rather than carried like a sovereign. Crowds gathered in silence. Some watched with pity, whispering prayers for the soul of the last Plantagenet king. Others jeered, spitting curses, their anger fueled by years of rumorby, the ghosts of the princes, by the tales of tyranny spread in his name. Children clung to their mother's skirts, peering at the broken figure as if glimpsing the wages of sin. For a monarch's desecration was not merely vengeance, it was theater, staged to etch fear into the hearts of all who might dream of defiance. His nakedness was deliberate, stripping him of the majesty of kingship, leaving only the frailty of man. Chroniclers note that wounds covered his body, slashes across arms and legs, a cleft to the skull. Whether inflicted in the frenzy of battle or in the cruelty after death, no one could say. What mattered was the spectacle. A cursed king, reduced to carrion for history's feast. Richard's body was displayed publicly, laid out in Leicester so that all might witness the fall of the White Boar. The message was unmistakable. The age of York was ended, the Tudors ascendant, and those who opposed them would meet the same fate. Even in death, Richard served his enemies, his corpse weaponized as propaganda. Yet beneath the humiliation lay tragedy. For all the scorn heaped upon him, Richard had fought with valor. He had charged into the heart of battle when others would have fled, and in dying thus, he claimed a kind of dignity no parade of shame could erase. The desecration of his body may have stained his memory, but it also sparked unease. Was this truly justice, or vengeance disguised as triumph? In time, his remains would vanish from sight, buried hastily, forgotten, only to resurface centuries later beneath a humble car park. But in that moment, August 1485, his broken form spoke louder than any herald. A warning, a curse, a symbol of the fleeting nature of crowns. The king was dead, the body desecrated, the dynasty extinguished, and England, bloodied yet again, turned to its new master. When Richard's body was cast aside, stripped of crown and dignity, another hand reached for destiny. Henry Tudor, until then a wandering exile with a fragile claim, emerged from Bosworth not merely as victor but as England's anointed. The crown, said to have been plucked from a hawthorn bush where it had fallen in the chaos of battle, was set upon his head. In that moment a dynasty was born. Henry VII, as he was now proclaimed, understood that kingship was not only won with steel but secured with narrative. The death of Richard was painted as divine justice. Chroniclers in Tudor service wrote of a tyrant struck down by God's will, of an usurper whose sins had summoned his ruin. The vanished princes in the Tower, the whispered curse of York, these tales became weapons sharpened into propaganda. The Tudors did not simply inherit power, they rewrote history to justify it. Henry's marriage vow to Elizabeth of York, the daughter of Edward IV, was the masterstroke. With their union, the red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York were entwined into the Tudor rose, a symbol of reconciliation. To a weary kingdom bled by decades of civil war, it promised peace. To Henry, it was insurance. By binding York's blood to his own, he silenced rivals and legitimized his rule. But peace was fragile, and Henry knew it. Rebellions flickered, pretenders rose claiming to be lost princes miraculously alive. Each challenge was met with ruthless efficiency. The Tudors understood that mercy bred doubt. Fear, however, bred obedience. Richard's fate was displayed as caution. This is what becomes of those who oppose the new order. In London, the coronation of Henry VII was staged with deliberate grandeur. Gold cloth shimmered, choirs thundered, and prayers echoed in solemn triumph. Yet beneath the pageantry lay an undeniable truth. The new king's claim was weaker in blood than in fortune. His legitimacy did not rest on lineage, rested on victory, and on the ability to tell a story strong enough to convince a nation. And so the story of Richard III became the cornerstone of Tudor myth. He was cast as the hunchbacked villain, the child murderer, the cursed usurper whose death brought salvation. Shakespeare, writing more than a century later under Elizabeth I, would immortalize this portrait in words that echoed through ages. A horse? A horse! My kingdom for a horse! The last Plantagenet king became theater. His sins exaggerated, his humanity erased, all in service of the dynasty that replaced him. Thus rose the Tudors not from blood alone, but from narrative. From Bosworth's mud, they forged a new England, built upon the ruin of the Yorkist dream and the silenced body of Richard III. The Age of Roses was ended. The Age of Tudors had begun. History remembers kings not as they were, but as they are told. Richard III, the last Plantagenet, became less a man than a canvas upon which victors painted their truths. To the Tudors, he was the monster in the Tower, the usurper cursed by God, a crooked body symbolizing a crooked soul. To Shakespeare, he was the archetype of villainous scheming, murderous, clawing for power with a smile as sharp as a dagger. For centuries, that was the Richard the world knew, a specter of ambition, a warning to tyrants. But history is never so simple. Was he truly the murderer of the princes, or a scapegoat for their disappearance? Was he a tyrant or a ruler who, in 2 brief years, enacted reforms that protected the poor and curbed corruption? Was he cursed by fate, or merely crushed beneath the weight of betrayal and rumor? Between myth and truth lies a space where certainty dissolves, and in that space Richard's ghost lingers. What cannot be denied is the tragedy of his destiny. Born into a world already drenched in civil war, he was shaped by shadows, hardened by loss, and driven by necessity as much as by ambition. He fought like a king at Bosworth, unyielding until the final breath, and died with more courage than many crowned before or after him. Whatever his sins, he did not meet his end as a coward, but as a warrior who refused to flee. Centuries later, when his remains were unearthed beneath a Leicester car park, the world was reminded that history does not bury its secrets forever. His skeleton told a different story. Not of a grotesque hunchback, but of a man with scoliosis imperfect, yes, but not monstrous. In that discovery, the myth cracked, and a fragment of humanity shone through. Richard III endures as a paradox. To some, he is the cursed heir, the child murderer whose reign was stolen and whose soul was damned. To others, he is the tragic king, betrayed by allies, defamed by victors, and denied the peace of legacy. He is both villain and victim, tyrant and martyr, a reminder that history is written not in stone, but in ink, and ink is wielded by those who survive. And so his story lives on, not merely as a chapter of England's past, but as a question whispered through time. Was Richard III the monster his enemies claimed, or the man whom fate and rumor conspired to destroy? Between myth and truth, his shadow walks still, a king cursed in memory, yet immortal in history.